When she stepped forward, I could tell immediately that her body arrived long before her spirit did. She held herself the way people do when they're used to being scolded for things they didn't cause, shoulders slightly tense, chin tucked just enough to avoid drawing attention, eyes flickering as though searching for the safest place to land. Most defendants walk in with a certain energy, anger, defensiveness, nervous humor. But she carried something different. Something quieter. She gripped a thin folder in both hands, the edges worn from overhandling, and tried to stand straight as if posture alone could keep her from unraveling. Even before she spoke, I sensed that this wasn't just about a ticket. There was a weight behind her silence, a story pressing against her ribs that she had never dared to tell. I asked for her name, and though the words came out clearly, her voice trembled like someone bracing for judgment long before I opened my mouth. What struck me most was the look on her face, not guilt, not defiance, but the kind of practiced politeness people develop when life has taught them to apologize for taking up space. She kept smoothing her sleeve every few seconds, a nervous rhythm that told me she wasn't worried about the fine. She was worried about what would happen if this moment went badly. And before she even explained why she was here, I realized something important. This wasn't a woman protecting herself. This was a woman protecting a life she was holding together by threads. And I knew, right then, that the courtroom was about to hear far more than a simple defense. I asked her to tell me what happened, and the way she inhaled told me I had stepped onto ground she'd been avoiding for a long time. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she blinked several times, gathering her courage the way some people gather scraps of paper before a presentation, not because they're unprepared, but because they're terrified of being misunderstood. When she finally spoke, her tone carried that familiar blend of apology and duty I've heard from countless people who've lived too long in someone else's shadow. She explained that the car wasn't hers, that she had been asked, instructed, really, to park it there by her employer. She said the word, instructed, with the kind of careful precision that told me she was used to choosing words that wouldn't get her into trouble later. Her eyes drifted downward as she spoke, and I noticed her thumb rubbing the edge of the folder, a tiny movement that betrayed the anxiety boiling under her calm exterior. She kept defending her employer even though I hadn't accused him of anything. That's when I knew there was more beneath the surface, more than a ticket, more than a simple mistake. I leaned back slightly, giving her space, because sometimes silence invites truth better than any question. And in that silence, I watched her shoulders fall just a bit, as though she were finally letting herself acknowledge the fear she had been carrying into this room. Not the fear of a fine, but the fear of consequences waiting outside the courtroom doors. I asked her whether her employer had taken responsibility for the car being left in a restricted zone, and her reaction was immediate, a subtle stiffening, a quick shake of the head, the faintest tightening in her jaw. It was the kind of reaction that doesn't come from defiance but from years of swallowing words that would have defended her. He said I should handle it, she murmured, as though the phrase itself was a weight she'd been forced to carry. The courtroom grew unusually quiet, and I could feel the eyes of everyone present shift toward her, not in judgment, but in recognition. Many people in that room knew what it felt like to be blamed for something they didn't cause. Her gaze drifted upward for only a second, just long enough for me to see the exhaustion beneath her polite expression, the exhaustion of someone who has spent far too long making herself responsible for other people's comfort. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was tired. Deeply, quietly tired. I leaned in a bit, softening my tone, because I wanted her to feel that this room was a place where she didn't need to protect anyone but herself. She swallowed slowly, almost painfully, before admitting that she didn't want to cause problems at work. That phrase alone told me everything. She had been living in survival mode, choosing silence over conflict, obedience over dignity. And as she stood there, clutching that folder like a lifeline, I realized this moment wasn't just about a citation. It was about a woman finally being seen. As she continued, her voice softened, but the truth inside her words grew heavier. I could see her fighting herself, wanting to stay composed, yet unable to hide the exhaustion etched into her face. She explained how everything had changed in a matter of months. One setback had led to another, like falling down a staircase you never meant to step on. Job hours cut. Bills piling up. A landlord who stopped being patient. And now, this ticket, something small to the city, but enormous to a person already counting every dollar. What struck me wasn't just her circumstances, but her determination to protect her dignity through all of it. She kept insisting she was managing, even as her voice betrayed how close she was to breaking. That's the thing about people like her, they don't come to court asking for sympathy. Most of them barely accept it even when it's offered. They come hoping, just hoping, that someone will believe they've been trying. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't afraid of the fine, she was afraid of one more thing crumbling in a life already stretched beyond its limits. Sometimes, the law is simple. People aren't. And this was one of those stories where the real issue wasn't written anywhere on the ticket. When I asked her what happened on the day of the violation, she hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because it's hard to explain chaos when you're living inside it. She described the morning with a level of detail that only comes from reliving something over and over. The phone call she wasn't prepared for. The sudden rush. The impossible choice between being late to work or dealing with a personal crisis that couldn't wait. She explained how she parked quickly, hoping she'd only be inside for a moment. But life doesn't pause for meter times. What she encountered took longer, and heavier, than she expected. By the time she returned, the ticket was already printed and tucked under her windshield, stiff and sharp like a reminder that even your emergencies don't excuse you from the world's timelines. As she spoke, I didn't just hear the facts. I heard a woman who'd been carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be carried alone. A woman trying to hold her life together with whatever strength she had left. And I knew, before she even finished, that this wasn't about carelessness. It was about survival. And sometimes, survival looks messy from the outside. I looked down at the ticket again, not because I needed to read it, but because I needed a moment to think. Judges aren't supposed to show emotion, at least, that's what the robe implies. But behind that bench, I'm still human. And cases like hers remind me why compassion matters just as much as the law. She stood there waiting, her hands clasped tightly together, as if bracing for impact. I've seen that posture more times than I can count, the stance of someone who has learned to expect disappointment. Someone who has heard, no, far more than, "It's going to be all right." I asked her one simple question. "If I reduce or dismiss this fine, what does that mean for you right now?" The way she inhaled told me everything before she even spoke. She said it wouldn't fix her life, but it would give her room to breathe. And sometimes, breathing room is the difference between collapsing and continuing. In that moment, I realized something important. This woman wasn't asking for a favor. She was asking for a chance. And when people show up with honesty, when they stand in front of me with nothing but the truth in their hands, I believe they deserve that chance. So I closed the folder gently, looked her in the eyes, and prepared to make a decision that wasn't just legal, but human. I leaned back slightly, giving her a moment to steady herself. Sometimes silence is more powerful than anything I could say. She stood there, eyes fixed on the edge of the judge's bench, not daring to look directly at me, not quite ready to believe anything good could come from this moment. I began gently, because people living on the edge don't need sharp words. "You've been carrying a lot," I said. Her eyes lifted just a little, almost like she was surprised that someone had actually noticed. I explained to her that the court recognizes emergencies, hardships, moments in life where everything piles up at once. The law isn't supposed to crush people who are already crushed. It's supposed to guide them. And sometimes, guiding means stepping back and seeing the person, not the penalty. As I spoke, I saw her shoulders slowly drop, not out of relief just yet, but out of disbelief. You could tell she wasn't used to anyone giving her the benefit of the doubt. I told her that life has a way of putting us through seasons that test every part of who we are. And when someone keeps fighting through those seasons, even when everything is working against them, they deserve recognition, not punishment. For the first time since she walked in, her breathing changed. There's a moment, I see it often, where someone realizes they might finally be safe. And in that moment, she finally looked up at me. Not with confidence. Not with expectation. But with hope. I took one more look at her file, even though my decision was already made. I wanted to do it carefully, with intention. People remember moments like this for the rest of their lives. The times when someone in authority chose compassion over convenience. Given everything you've explained, I began, letting each word land softly. I'm going to dismiss this violation. The reaction was immediate, but quiet. She didn't gasp, didn't break down, didn't cheer. She just froze, as though her mind needed a second to process that, for once, something had gone her way. Her eyes glistened, but she held herself together with that same worn dignity she carried in. I told her the dismissal wasn't a reward. It was recognition of effort, honesty, and the fact that she had been doing the best she could with a deck that life stacked against her. She whispered, "Thank you," barely audible, but filled with more sincerity than most people ever hear in a lifetime. She gathered her folder, holding it gently, no longer like a shield, but like a weight she could finally set down. As she turned to leave, I said one more thing, something I hope she'd remember long after she walked out of that courtroom. You're stronger than you think. And you deserve a chance to breathe. She paused, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. As she stood there absorbing what had just happened, I could sense the shift inside her, the kind of quiet transformation that doesn't come from grand speeches, but from finally being seen. This wasn't just about a parking ticket or a missed payment. This was about a woman who had been carrying her world alone for too long. I spoke more softly now, letting the courtroom calm settle around us. Life doesn't hand out mercy very often, I said. But when someone is honestly trying, it's our job to acknowledge that effort. She nodded slowly, as if each word loosened a knot she'd been holding inside her chest for months. And if you're still watching, tap like and subscribe, it helps us share more real stories like this. She didn't smile yet, but something lighter flickered behind her tired eyes. She took a breath that sounded different from the ones before, not rushed, not defensive, simply human. And in that breath, I could see her beginning to believe she had permission to hope again. I noticed her gripping the strap of her worn bag, the leather frayed from use, the corners softened by years of survival. People often think the courtroom is only about laws and penalties, but they forget it's also a place where someone's entire life can be reflected in how they carry themselves. I leaned forward gently. Before you leave, I said, I want you to understand something. Her attention snapped back to me, unsure but listening with the kind of intensity that only comes from someone who hasn't heard encouraging words in a long time. You walked in today prepared to be punished, I continued. But you walked out with a reminder that not every mistake defines you. For a moment, she stood completely still, as though the room itself had paused with her. Then she exhaled, a long, trembling breath that felt like the first step out of a storm she'd been trapped in. She didn't thank me again, she didn't need to. The way she straightened her posture said more than words ever could. As she stepped back from the bench, there was a subtle hesitation in her movement, as if her feet weren't entirely convinced she was allowed to walk away without another blow waiting around the corner. It's something I've seen countless times. People who have lived so long on the edge that kindness feels like a trick, or a temporary illusion that will disappear the moment they reach for it. I watched her posture, the way her hands trembled just slightly as she adjusted the strap of her bag again, almost grounding herself with that small motion. The courtroom was silent except for the faint rustling of papers, yet the air felt thick with everything she wasn't saying. I spoke softly, hoping to anchor her back into the present. You don't need to rush out, I told her. Take a moment. Let yourself breathe. She blinked, surprised that anyone would offer her even that small grace. A single tear threatened to fall, but she held it in, not wanting to look fragile. Yet fragility is not weakness, it is simply evidence of how much someone has battled. And in that moment, I could see that her fight hadn't been fueled by anger or defiance, but by a quiet resilience that had carried her through storms no one else had seen. She nodded once, gripping the edge of the podium like someone steadying themselves before stepping into a new world they never thought they'd experience. I allowed her a quiet moment before continuing, letting the weight of the courtroom settle into something gentler. When people come in here, I said, they often think their circumstances define their worth. But life doesn't work like that. It's not the fall that shapes a person, it's what they choose to rise for. She seemed to absorb those words slowly, as if storing them away for a day when the world would once again try to convince her she wasn't enough. The fluorescent lights overhead softened against the muted greens of the courtroom walls, and her shadow stretched faintly behind her, thin, almost fragile, but still standing. I could tell she was waiting for some hidden condition, some warning, something that would take the kindness back. People who've been disappointed often expect generosity to come with a catch. There's nothing else, I reassured her. You're free to go. For the first time, her face opened in a hesitant, trembling smile, not wide or confident, but real. And that smile, small as it was, carried more courage than most grand gestures ever could. She gathered her papers with deliberate care, like someone reclaiming a part of her life she thought she'd lost. And when she turned to walk toward the exit, it was with a steadiness that hadn't been there when she first arrived. As she made her way toward the aisle, I watched the transformation happening in real time, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and deeply human. The kind of change that doesn't come from winning a case, but from finally feeling like life hasn't shut every door in your face. She paused just a few steps from the exit, almost as if something invisible pulled her back. It wasn't hesitation or fear, it was the unfamiliar weight of relief settling into her bones. Her back straightened just a little, and for the first time, she wasn't shrinking herself to fit the moment. People who struggle for long periods often learn to make themselves small, as though taking up space makes them more vulnerable to being judged. But right then, she seemed to realize she deserved to stand tall, even if only for a breath. The courtroom lights caught the faintest shimmer in her eyes, the kind that comes from finally exhaling after months of holding everything inside. She turned slightly, not toward me, but toward the idea that maybe the world wasn't as unforgiving as she believed. The bailiff glanced at her with a soft nod, and that simple gesture, acknowledgement without pity, seemed to steady her even more. She didn't wipe her eyes, she didn't break down, she simply let herself feel the moment without running from it. And in that small, fragile pause, I could see her stepping into a version of herself she hadn't met in a very long time. Before she reached the doors, I spoke again, not to call her back, but to give her something I knew she needed to hear. You know, I said gently, sometimes life teaches us through hardship. But it also surprises us through grace. Don't forget to allow room for both. She turned her head slightly, not enough for a full glance, but just enough that I saw her profile soften. It was the look of someone who had always braced for the worst, finally realizing she didn't have to today. Her fingers tightened and loosened again around the strap of her worn bag, as though she was relearning how to carry something that no longer felt unbearably heavy. Moments like this don't erase past pain, they don't magically fix the struggles waiting outside those courtroom doors. But they do something quieter, something more enduring, they plant a seed. And if someone like her, who has fought invisible battles without applause or support, can walk away with even a small seed of belief in herself, then the moment is worth everything. As she reached the final steps toward the exit, she lifted her chin with a courage that wasn't loud or bold, but steady. The kind of courage that grows from being reminded that even the most worn-down people still deserve a fair shot at tomorrow. And with that, she pushed the door open, stepping into a world that suddenly felt just a little less heavy than the one she carried inside. After she stepped through the door, the room felt noticeably quieter, as though her presence had carried a certain weight that only became evident once it was gone. I looked down at the empty space she'd left behind and thought about how many people walk into courtrooms expecting judgment, not understanding. They come in armored not because they want to fight, but because the world has convinced them nobody will ever stand on their side. And every now and then, someone like her reminds me why compassion matters, not as a gift, not as charity, but as recognition of the battles we don't always see. The bailiff gathered a few papers, casting a brief glance toward the doorway as if replaying the moment in his own mind. Even he seemed moved in a way he didn't show often. I tapped my gavel lightly, more out of reflection than procedure, letting the sound echo just enough to settle the air. Some cases blur together over time, but every so often, one stands out, not because of the fine or the violation, but because of the humanity revealed in the process. Her resilience, her quiet tremor, her attempt to hold herself together even when standing on shaking ground, that's what lingered with me. People think judges only deal in penalties. But sometimes the job is simply to acknowledge that someone walked into this room carrying an entire world of hurt, and for a brief moment, they didn't have to carry it alone. A few moments later, the next case file appeared on my desk, but I didn't open it right away. Instead, I let myself sit with the weight of what had just happened. Not every courtroom moment changes a life, but some moments create a shift, small but powerful, that allows someone to move forward with their dignity intact. I imagined her outside the courthouse now, standing for a moment on the steps, probably still unsure whether to believe what had happened. Maybe she'd take out her phone to call someone, or maybe she had no one to call. Maybe she'd walk straight to work or hurry back home to her father. Or maybe, for the first time in a long time, she'd simply stop and breathe. In a world that constantly pushes people past their limits, breathing can be its own quiet act of rebellion. I hope she used this day as a reminder that she wasn't invisible, that the world hadn't given up on her, even if she'd sometimes felt like it had. And as I finally reached for the next file, I wondered if she knew just how strong she truly was. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through trembling hands, tired eyes, and a voice that still chooses honesty despite fear. She walked in expecting punishment. She walked out rediscovering her worth. And that, more than any legal outcome, is the kind of justice that stays with you. I reflected on her story long after she left the courtroom. Even though the case was technically closed, the impact lingered in the subtle shifts of the room, the way the bailiff moved more carefully with his papers, the slight hush that had fallen over the gallery. These aren't just empty moments, they're echoes of something deeper. Life teaches lessons in small increments, but some lessons strike like a lightning bolt, reshaping perspective. Her courage, quiet, unassuming, yet utterly persistent, reminded me that the human spirit can endure far more than it often admits. I thought about all the people waiting outside the courthouse that day, carrying their own hidden battles, and realized that every act of understanding in a place of authority can ripple far beyond a single moment. Justice is more than punishment or reward, it's recognition. Recognition of struggle, of perseverance, and of a life lived with honesty in the face of hardship. I smiled softly to myself, knowing that while the world may not always reward effort, acknowledgement is sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person. And she deserved that, more than anyone else in that room could have guessed. As I turned to organize the next set of files, I couldn't help but replay the subtle moments that defined her day in court. The slight tremor in her hands, the careful choice of words, the invisible weight she carried for months compressed into every movement she made. I realized that often, justice isn't measured in fines or citations, but in the humanity we recognize and the dignity we restore. There's something sacred about that moment when a person realizes they've been seen, truly seen, for who they are, not the mistakes they made. I thought about the audience, how many of them have faced similar moments, standing alone while the world judged them, waiting for someone to notice their quiet courage. This case wasn't extraordinary in a legal sense. It was extraordinary in life. Because for someone who's been balancing chaos and responsibility in silence, even a small act of understanding becomes monumental. And it is in those moments, when judgment and compassion intersect, that true human connection emerges, a connection that lingers long after the gavel falls. Just as the courtroom settled into silence, and I thought her story had reached its quiet conclusion, something unexpected happened. She turned back toward the bench, her eyes meeting mine with a spark I hadn't noticed before, not fear, not hesitation, but clarity. Then she spoke softly, yet with a strength that cut through the weight of months she had carried alone. She admitted she had been preparing herself for failure, for judgment, even for ridicule, but in that moment she realized the courage she thought she lacked had been inside her all along. The twist wasn't in the dismissal of the ticket, or in my words of encouragement, it was in her own awakening. She understood, for the first time, that life's hardships don't define her, but her resilience does. Every tremor of fear, every anxious breath she had carried into the courtroom had forged a strength no citation, no reprimand, and no misfortune could take away. I watched as she finally let herself release the burden she'd been holding for so long, not with tears or dramatic gestures, but with the simple, quiet dignity of someone who has discovered that being seen, being heard, and being acknowledged can change a life. And in that revelation, I saw the essence of what I've always believed: justice is more than law, it is the recognition of the human heart, its struggles, and its capacity to rise. She left the courtroom not only lighter, but transformed, carrying the subtle, enduring lesson that strength is often quiet, resilience is invisible, and hope is found in the moments we are seeing. Thank you for watching. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe for more real courtroom moments.